Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, please leave a comment with where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts go. In the fall of 1892, the small town of Black Hollow in the Missouri Ozarks became the center of events that would stump even the most experienced investigators of the time. This small community of no more than 40 people lived in the rugged hills of Taney County, following rhythms that had been set long before the Civil War ever touched their mountains. The hollow itself was almost 3 miles long and was surrounded by steep limestone bluffs. It could only be reached by a narrow trail that wound through thick oak and hickory forests. Most people who lived there had never gone more than 25 miles northeast to the nearest trading post in Forsyth. The mountain paths were dangerous and killed people every winter. Black Hollow's geography made it a natural fortress of solitude. There were dozens of springs that came up from the limestone bedrock and fed Bull Creek as it wound its way through the valley floor. Travelers would go miles out of their way to fill their containers from these mountain springs because the water was so clean. This same isolation that gave people life-giving water also made it possible for families to disappear without a trace, for secrets to grow for generations, and for the line between civilization and wilderness to become less clear. Archaeological evidence indicated that diverse Native American groups inhabited the hollow for centuries prior to European colonization. Creek and Cherokee hunting parties used the large cave systems as temporary homes during the winter. They left behind pictographs and other things that early settlers found both interesting and scary. These old markings showed scenes that looked like they were recording rituals and practices that were very different from the religious traditions that Christian settlers were used to. The symbols that showed people changing, with their bodies stretched and distorted in ways that looked like either artistic symbolism or records of real events, were even more troubling. The Grimm family homestead was the center of this community. It was a weathered log building that Heinrich Grimm built in 1847 when he first claimed the land under the Federal Homestead Acts. Heinrich came to the Ozarks as part of a wave of German immigrants who brought skilled workers and farmers to the frontier. He knew a lot about traditional European folk medicine and farming methods that helped him a lot in the tough mountain setting. The first cabin he built showed that he knew a lot about the area's building materials and weather. It had features that wouldn't become common in the area for another generation. Jacob Grimm, a 3-year-old man, had the property by 1892. He lived there with his wife Martha and their 4 children. Samuel, 19. Rebecca, 17. Young Henrik, 12. And little Mary, who was only 8 years old. Jacob got not only his father's land, but also his vast knowledge of traditional medicine and his library of books and manuscripts that talked about things that weren't often talked about in frontier communities. It was strange for a library to be in such a remote place as the Grimm family library. Jacob had books on botany, anatomy, and natural philosophy that would have been considered advanced even in big cities in the East. The handwritten journals and notebooks that had been passed down through generations of the family were even more interesting. They were full of detailed notes about the plants, caves, and rocks in the area. The way the Grimms systematically investigated and wrote about their mountain home in these manuscripts showed that they saw it as more than just a place to farm and raise animals. Martha Grimm, whose maiden name was Schneider, grew up in a similar German immigrant family in the county next door. She had a lot of education for a woman on the frontier. She could read and write in both German and English, do basic math, and knew a lot about herbal medicine and how to preserve food. In 1870, she married Jacob, and their neighbors said that the first few years of their marriage were very happy. People knew Martha was smart, good at treating injuries and illnesses, and able to predict the weather with amazing accuracy. The Grimm kids learned an unusual mix of practical skills for living on the frontier and academic subjects. Samuel, the oldest, was very good at tracking and hunting, but he also liked to read his father's books and manuscripts. He could read and write in both German and English, and he knew more about the geography of the area than people who were much older than him. Rebecca had similar intellectual gifts, but she was more interested in studying plants and their medicinal properties. Henrik and Mary were still figuring out who they were, but both showed signs of the family's unique mix of practical skills and scholarly interests. Henrik was very sensitive to changes in the weather and the behavior of animals, while Mary was very good at finding water sources and getting through thick forests without getting lost. People in Black Hollow had mixed feelings about the Grimm family. People respected them for what they knew and could do, and they were often called upon when neighbors had medical emergencies or farming problems. But there was also a feeling of unease about what the family was doing and what they were interested in. People said they spent a lot of time exploring cave systems that other people stayed away from, and they were said to know more about the area's history and geography than what could be learned by just looking around and living there. The first sign that something was wrong came on the 15th of October, 1892, when Samuel Grimm didn't come back from checking the family's trap lines along Roar Creek. The boy had left before dawn, as he always did. He took his father's old percussion rifle and a small canvas bag to put any game he found in. He also brought a leather-bound notebook with him where he wrote down what he saw about how animals acted and how the weather changed. This notebook would later turn out to be one of the few real clues about what happened to him. Jacob got 3 neighboring families, the Kellys, the Hoffmans, and the McLeods, to help him look for his brother when it got dark and he hadn't come back. These were skilled woodsmen who knew every path and landmark within 15 miles of the hollow. Even though it was hard to get around in the dark on the rough ground, the search started right away. They gathered torches and lanterns, and the men spread out in a way that would cover the routes that Samuel was most likely to have taken. They found Samuel's rifle next to the creek, with the barrel submerged in the shallow water. There were no signs of damage or struggle on the weapon, and it was still loaded with the same charge Jacob had made that morning. His canvas bag was nearby, ripped and empty, but the way it was ripped looked like it was done on purpose instead of by accident. The most upsetting thing was that his notebook was missing. Samuel never went anywhere without it, and anyone who knew what was in it would have found it useful. The tracks found in the soft mud along the bank were hard to explain and would be talked about and debated by people in the hollow for many years to come. There were clear signs of Samuel's boot prints in several places, which showed that he had walked along the creek bank for a while before stopping where his rifle was found. But there were also impressions next to his tracks that made it hard for the observer to understand what they were seeing. Thomas Kelly, who had been tracking game through these mountains for more than 50 years, later told the county sheriff that the prints that went with the tracks looked like they were made by bare feet, but they were very big and out of proportion. The impressions looked like feet that were longer and narrower than normal, with toes that looked like they were too long. The depth of the impression suggested that the person weighed a lot, maybe 200 pounds or more. But the length of the stride and the way they walked made it seem like they were much smaller. It was even more confusing to find more print types that looked like they belonged to more than one person. Some impressions looked completely normal, which means that at least one person with a normal build and walk was probably involved. Some had traits that the experienced trackers couldn't put into any of the categories they had. The way the tracks were laid out made it look like there had been a meeting or gathering by the creek, and Samuel's movements showed that he had come willingly and not because he was being forced to. The search went on for 3 days, and more people joined the original group, including men from as far away as Branson and Hollister. They found bits of Samuel's clothes stuck in thorny bushes almost 2 miles from where they found his rifle, but the fabric didn't look like it had been used in a fight or violence. Instead, the tears seemed to be the result of moving quickly through thick plants, as if Samuel had been running or moving quickly through places where normal travel would require careful navigation. The trail of fabric scraps led to the most remote and difficult parts of the area, where even experienced hunters rarely went because of the dangerous mix of steep cliffs, unstable rock formations, and cave systems that could easily trap someone who wasn't careful. The last piece of clothing belonging to Samuel was found at the bottom of a steep rock face that rose almost 100 feet above Roar Creek. It looked like it would be impossible to get to without special climbing gear. During this time of intense searching, the Grimm family members' behavior caught the attention of both their neighbors and the volunteers who had come to help. In these kinds of situations, family members usually had strong emotional reactions, but the Grimm's reactions were seen as strange and troubling by many people who saw them. Martha Grimm acted in ways that were either unnaturally calm or almost detached from the crisis at hand. She kept up with her daily routines with mechanical precision, even though other mothers in similar situations might have been overwhelmed with grief, worry, or frantic activity. She kept cooking for the search parties, doing chores around the house, and taking care of her other kids as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. When asked directly about Samuel's disappearance, she talked about him as if he were just late instead of missing, saying she was sure he would come back when he was done with what he was doing. Martha's claims that she knew where Samuel was through dreams and visions were even more upsetting to the search volunteers. She talked about talking to her son while she was sleeping. She said that he told her he was safe and that he was doing important work that kept him from coming back right away. At first, these claims were dismissed as the wishful thinking of a worried mother, but in several cases, Martha's detailed descriptions of places and activities turned out to be very accurate. Sheriff Henry Colson came from the county seat in Forsyth and found a situation that was unlike anything he had ever dealt with before, either on the frontier or in his own family. Sheriff Colson had been a lawman for 15 years and had worked on a lot of cases involving missing people, domestic violence, and accidents in the woods. He was proud of how quickly he could figure out what was going on and what the most likely reasons were for strange things happening. After talking to Martha Grimm, he was very upset. Her answers to his questions were thoughtful, thorough, and consistent with each other, but they painted a picture of events that seemed to be happening in a different world than what other family members and neighbors were seeing. She said that Samuel had been getting ready for this disappearance for weeks, collecting supplies and information for what she called an important journey of discovery. She said that he was missing on purpose and of his own free will, not because of an accident or foul play. Martha's comments about Samuel's involvement in activities that she said were continuing the work of people who had lived in the area before were even more concerning. She talked about how the cave systems in the hollow held ancient knowledge that had been passed down through generations of people who knew the true nature of the mountain environment. Martha said that Samuel had shown an unusual interest in this secret knowledge and had been chosen to help keep it safe and share it with others. Sheriff Colson's efforts to get more detailed information about these claims were frustrating. Martha's explanations were thorough and consistent, but they talked about ideas and activities that didn't seem to have anything to do with what was happening in the real world. She talked about communication networks that didn't use normal methods, knowledge that could be sent directly from one mind to another, and discoveries that had been made in the secret rooms under the mountains. The sheriff talked to other members of the Grimm family and learned more disturbing things about how the family worked and how Samuel acted in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Rebecca, the oldest daughter, told me that Samuel had been having strange dreams and visions that started in late August. He had talked about hearing voices calling to him from the deep woods, voices that seemed to know a lot about his life and family history. Rebecca said that these voices had given Samuel a lot of information about the cave systems in the area, such as where chambers and passages were that weren't shown on any maps. Samuel had started going into these underground areas alone, bringing back artifacts and specimens that he said proved that there had been people living there before who were smarter and more skilled than the people who live there now. Even though he was young, Henrik was able to give more information about how his brother's interests and behavior were changing. He said that Samuel had started talking in a language that no one in the family understood and was having long conversations with people who were not visible to other family members. It seemed like these conversations were more about sharing information than just showing signs of mental illness. Samuel asked questions and got detailed answers about a wide range of topics, from local history to advanced farming and medical techniques. The boy also said that he had seen Samuel in strange places on the family property at strange times, often standing still in ways that made it look like he was listening closely to sounds that other people couldn't hear. Heinrich had followed his brother into the woods several times, watching as Samuel walked directly to certain places without using trails or landmarks. He moved with confidence through terrain that would have been difficult for experienced woodsmen. Jacob Grimm's answers to questions were just as disturbing, but for different reasons than his wife's. Martha was sure that Samuel was safe and had a purpose, but Jacob was very worried and confused about his son's disappearance. He admitted that Samuel had been acting strangely lately, but he said that these changes were just normal for a kid growing up in a remote area and not because of anything supernatural or unexplained. More importantly, Jacob told Sheriff Colson that the family had a lot of written records about Black Hollow's history and geography. These records had been made by different people who lived there over the years. Jacob said that these papers had detailed maps of cave systems, descriptions of artifacts and markings found in underground chambers, and stories of strange things that had happened in the area over the course of more than 100 years. Sheriff Colson was worried that Jacob didn't want to give the investigation these papers, but he didn't have the legal power to force Jacob to give them up without proof of a crime. Jacob said that the materials were fragile and could be dangerous if they were misunderstood. He was also worried that making them public could lead to treasure hunting and vandalism that would harm important historical sites. After 4 days of hard work by more than 30 volunteers, the official search for Samuel was called off on October 19th. The choice was made because the resources that were available had run out, and more searching would need tools and knowledge that weren't available in the area. Sheriff Colson filed a formal missing person report and asked for help from the federal government. However, because the area was so far away and there wasn't much evidence, it was unlikely that more resources would be put into the case. Some people were impressed by Jacob Grimm's calmness when the official search came to an end, while others were disturbed. He thanked the volunteers who had helped and said how thorough their work had been, but he didn't seem desperate or hopeful, which is what you would expect from a father in this situation. Instead, he talked about accepting God's will and having faith that God's timing would reveal Samuel's fate in the end. As fall turned into winter, the Grimm family fell into routines that showed how much they missed their oldest son. However, these routines also showed that they were ready and willing to accept his death, which seemed strange given how sudden it was. The other family members took on Samuel's duties in a way that showed they had planned ahead, and the family's daily life went on with only a few minor interruptions. A lot of people in Black Hollow talked about how Martha Grimm acted during this time. She started going on long walks by herself to the same places where Samuel had gone missing, sometimes staying away from the cabin for hours at a time. When asked about these trips, she said that the forest made her feel peaceful and clear, and that her walks helped her stay spiritually connected to her missing son. Martha went on these trips alone to places that even experienced hunters were careful about. She knew a lot about the geography of the area that she couldn't have learned just by exploring it casually. She also knew a lot about cave entrances and underground passages that weren't shown on any maps. People who saw her on these walks said that she moved confidently and with purpose through the rough terrain, following paths that looked like they had been carefully planned ahead of time. It was even more worrying that people said they had seen Martha in places, and at times that seemed impossible given the distances and the difficult terrain. Several people said they saw her at the same time in different parts of the hollow, which led to speculation about whether she was getting help from unknown accomplices or whether the witnesses had made a mistake in identifying her. Rebecca Grimm, who is now the oldest child still living at home, took on many of her mother's household duties with a level of maturity that seemed to be beyond her 17 years. Neighbors said that she had changed from a happy, curious young woman to someone who looked very serious and almost haunted. She didn't talk much, unless someone talked to her directly, and she stopped going to community events and social gatherings that she used to enjoy. The girl's change was most clear in how she interacted with the natural world around the family's home. Rebecca used to like going into the woods and fields near the cabin to collect plants for her botanical studies and help with outdoor work. But after Samuel went missing, she seemed to not want to go far from the house, and she showed signs of anxiety when she had to go into the woods, even for short trips. Young Henrik and Mary showed how they were dealing with the changes in their family life in their own troubling ways. Henrik's violent outbursts became more and more common. He would hit his sister or break things around the house for no apparent reason. After these episodes, he would go through times of complete withdrawal, during which he would stay silent and not respond for hours at a time. The boy also started to show signs of the unusual sensitivity to environmental conditions that had been a part of Samuel's behavior. He could accurately predict changes in the weather and animal behavior that were beyond what most kids could do. Mary, who was 8 years old, went through the most dramatic change of any family member. Before, she was a talkative and curious child who loved asking questions and exploring her surroundings. Now, she is quiet and withdrawn, and she can often be found staring out the cabin windows at the tree line for long periods of time. When she did talk, she often talked about conversations she said she had with Samuel, giving detailed accounts of exchanges that made it seem like she was still in touch with her missing brother. The winter of 1892–93 was especially bad in the Ozarks, with heavy snows that started in late November and didn't stop until March. The isolation that was already a defining feature of Black Hollow became complete when the mountain passes became impassable, and communication with the outside world was limited to occasional visits by the most determined travelers. Families had to rely completely on the food they had stored, preserved, and hunted and trapped, even though the weather was so bad. During this time of forced isolation, the Grimm family began to experience the most disturbing events. Henrik broke into the cabin of their closest neighbors, the Kellys, in a state of complete hysteria just days before Christmas, which was the first sign that things were going wrong. Even though it was freezing outside, the boy was barely dressed. His feet were bleeding from running through snow that was more than a foot deep in most places. Henrik's story about what was going on at his family's cabin was hard to follow and not very clear, but some parts were consistent and very disturbing. He said that his mother was going through some kind of change that made her look less and less like the person he had known as a child. The boy said that Martha spent most of her time doing things that he couldn't understand or explain, like speaking in languages that none of the family members knew and doing things that didn't seem to have any real use. Henrik's descriptions of how his father reacted to these changes were even more upsetting. Jacob's wife's behavior had apparently upset him so much that he had started sleeping in the root cellar under the cabin and only coming out when he absolutely had to do things like take care of the animals or get firewood. The boy said that his father was always scared because he thought the woman living in their cabin was not his wife, but an imposter or someone who was possessed. Thomas Kelly and his adult son William went back to the Grimm homestead with Henrik right away, even though it was dangerous and they were worried about what they might find there. It took them more than an hour to get through the deep snow, and they got to the cabin just as it was getting dark. Both men would remember and talk about what they saw there for the rest of their lives. There were no signs of trouble or violence on the outside of the cabin, and smoke was coming out of the chimney in a calm way. But the inside of the building told a very different story that made the visitors question what they were seeing. The furniture in the main living area had been moved around so that it was in places that didn't seem to serve any useful purpose. Things that had been put away in logical places were now spread out across the room in ways that seemed to follow some kind of organizational system that the visitors couldn't understand. What was even more disturbing was the different things and materials that had been added to the room since the Kellys last visited. There were glass containers filled with plant material and unknown liquids on every surface. Each one was carefully labeled with symbols that didn't look like any writing system the visitors knew. There were lots of dried herbs and roots hanging from the rafters, making a complicated web of organic materials that smelled strong and strange. The Kellys didn't recognize Martha Grimm at first because she looked so different from the woman they had known for more than 20 years. She was sitting in her rocking chair by the fire. She had lost a lot of weight, and her clothes hung loosely on a body that looked like it had gotten smaller. Her hair, which used to be a deep brown and well-kept, had become wild and messy, with premature gray streaks that made her look decades older than she really was. The changes in her eyes and face were the most troubling. Martha's eyes had become so intense that it was very uncomfortable to look her in the eye. Her face also seemed sharper and more angular than before. When she talked to the visitors, her voice changed. The way she pronounced words and the way she stressed them made it sound like she was speaking English as a second language instead of the language she had spoken all her life in the Hollow. She said hello to Thomas and William Kelly by name, but the way she acted made it seem like she was remembering their relationship rather than really recognizing or connecting with them. She answered questions about her family's situation and Henrik's troubled state of mind with facts, but her tone was cold and detached, which didn't seem like normal parental concern. It was even more worrying that she kept talking about how Samuel was still living in the house. Martha talked about her missing son as if he were still there, talking about recent conversations and things they did together as if he had never gone missing. When the Kellys tried to remind her that Samuel had been missing for more than 2 months, she agreed with their worry but said that their view of the situation was based on incomplete information about how people think and talk to each other. Martha just pointed to the floor when Thomas Kelly asked where Jacob was. This was because the root cellar was under the cabin. Jacob Grimm was huddled among the stored vegetables and preserved meats when the visitors found him. He was wrapped in blankets and shivering. Even though the underground space was fairly warm, the man they found didn't look anything like the confident, skilled farmer they had known for years. Jacob's body showed that he had been living in the cellar for a long time, getting food and water from Rebecca through a system of ropes and baskets. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook. This could have been because he was cold, scared, or a mix of both. Most importantly, he looked like he had aged years in just a few months. His face was lined with deep lines, and he always looked worried. Jacob's visitors didn't understand what he was saying about his living situation, but they could tell he was really scared. He said that the woman who lived above them in the cabin was not his wife anymore. Instead, she was some kind of replacement or transformed version of Martha who had powers and knowledge that no normal person could have. He said that he heard her talking to several people at night, even though no one had been seen coming or going from the remote homestead. Jacob's stories about finding proof that Martha was doing things that seemed to require knowledge of chemistry, botany, and other subjects she had never studied were even more disturbing. He talked about finding complicated tools and materials that seemed to be connected to some kind of organized research or experimentation. This work was being done using rules and methods that he didn't understand. Jacob also said that Martha had started to show skills that seemed to go beyond what most people can do. She seemed to know about things happening far away without being able to get information through normal means. And she seemed to know a lot about the huge cave systems under Black Hollow, which could only have been learned through years of careful exploration. The most worrying thing was that she seemed to be talking to people who weren't there in person and having long conversations that made it seem like she had access to knowledge that was outside of what most people know. The Kellys tried to get Jacob and Martha to accept help from the community, but neither of them seemed to be able to admit that their situation was unusual or bad. Jacob said he was safer in the root cellar and that anyone who tried to stop Martha from doing what she wanted would face consequences that he couldn't fully explain. Martha understood their worry, but she said that their view of the situation was based on a misunderstanding of what her current job and duties were. People could sometimes see young Rebecca peeking around corners and moving through the cabin shadows, but she stayed away from the visitors and seemed to be in a constant state of worry about her family's situation. When Thomas Kelly tried to talk to her directly, she ran to parts of the cabin where the visitors couldn't follow her, which made it seem like she had been told to stay away from people she didn't know. The most puzzling thing was that young Mary was nowhere to be found, even after a thorough search of the cabin and the area around it. When asked where the child was, Martha gave vague answers that made it sound like Mary was safe and well cared for, but busy with things that needed privacy and focus. When asked separately, Jacob said he hadn't seen his youngest daughter in several weeks and was very worried about what would happen to her. The Kellys were upset by what they had seen, so they convinced Henrik to come back to their cabin with them. There, he could be properly fed and cared for while they figured out what to do about his family's situation. The boy was their main source of information about how things were getting worse in the Grimm household, but the adults often found it hard to believe or accept what he said because it was so disturbing. Henrik says that his mother's changes started slowly in the weeks after Samuel went missing, but they sped up a lot as winter got colder and the family became completely cut off from the outside world. Martha had been spending more and more time looking at the Grimm family's collection of books and manuscripts that had been passed down through the generations. She was especially interested in books and manuscripts that dealt with natural history, geology, and what Henrik called underground knowledge. The boy said that Martha had started going on regular trips to cave systems that were close enough to the family home that she could walk there. She would come back with different materials and specimens that she would process and store in a way that seemed to follow systematic scientific principles. These things mostly happened during the day when the kids were busy with their own things, but Henrik sometimes saw his mother working from hidden places. Henrik's stories about things that happened at night that he saw from his sleeping area in the cabin's loft were even more worrying. He said that Martha often left the cabin after the family was supposed to be asleep and stayed away for hours at a time, even though the winter weather was dangerous and the hollow was completely dark during the long winter nights. He had seen his mother leave and come back through the small window by his bed several times. He noticed that she moved through the rough terrain with confidence, as if she had been there before and knew how to get there, which would have been hard for even experienced outdoorsmen to do during the day. Henrik's claims about people coming to the cabin at night were even more disturbing. He said he saw people coming toward the homestead after dark. These people moved through the snow without leaving the deep tracks that would normally be expected. It seemed like these visitors were talking to Martha in ways that didn't involve normal speech, and their meetings sometimes lasted for hours before they left without saying a word. The boy's stories about these strange visitors were incomplete and inconsistent, but some details kept coming up. He talked about people who looked very tall and thin, moved in a way that didn't seem completely natural, and wore clothes that didn't seem to protect them from the harsh winter weather, but they didn't seem to be bothered by the cold. Henrik said that these visitors brought Martha a lot of different things that she used in her ongoing work and experiments. He said that during these nighttime meetings he saw boxes, containers, and wrapped packages being passed around. These items were later put in places in the cabin and root cellar that were only for Martha to use. The Kellys had a problem that was common in small, isolated communities on the frontier, but it was still hard to solve in a way that everyone was happy with. The closest police station was in Forsyth, which was more than 25 miles away and almost impossible to get to in the winter. Also, they weren't sure if the strange things they saw were breaking any laws. A woman doing strange experiments and a man hiding in his root cellar could be signs of a domestic crisis, but they were not strong enough to prove that a crime had been committed. The strange people who came by at night could be explained as neighbors helping out or doing business that they didn't want to talk about for personal reasons. The stress of losing a child and the difficulties of life on the frontier during a very harsh winter could explain the big changes in Martha's looks and behavior. After a lot of talking, the Kellys decided to ask Reverend Isaiah Morris for help. He was a circuit preacher who traveled through the area on a regular basis and was going to Black Hollow in the third week of January. Reverend Morris had dealt with similar problems in other small towns and had the power and experience to figure out what to do. In the meantime, they agreed to take care of Henrik and keep an eye on the Grimm homestead as best they could, given the weather and the family's apparent desire for privacy. They also told other families in the hollow to keep an eye out for any signs of more problems or emergencies that might need the community to act. The next few weeks were some of the hardest and most upsetting in the memory of people who had lived in Black Hollow for a long time. The bad weather went on, making travel and communication very dangerous. However, there were reports of strange things happening near the Grimm property. Several neighbors said they saw lights moving through the woods at night. The lights were too bright and steady to be explained by torches or lanterns. These lights seemed to move in a set way, following paths that linked different cave entrances and other important geographical features in the area. Different families saw the lights on different nights, which suggests that they were part of a planned event rather than random or accidental ones. Reports of sounds echoing through the hollow in the early morning hours, especially just before dawn, were even more disturbing. People said that these sounds sounded like human voices, but they were speaking in languages that no one could understand. The voices seemed to carry clearly through the winter air, even though there were obvious distances that should have made it impossible for them to talk to each other. Sometimes they went on for hours at a time. Thomas Kelly, who knew the most about the local wildlife and natural events, looked into these reports as thoroughly as the weather allowed. His observations confirmed that the sounds were not made by any known animals in the area. Instead, their characteristics suggested that they were made by human vocal cords making organized speech patterns. But the sound's acoustic properties showed that they were coming from places that seemed impossible to get to in the winter. Tracking expeditions that some residents tried during short periods when the weather was good for travel gave more disturbing evidence. The snow that covered the hollow all winter should have kept clear signs of any movement in the area, but the tracks that were found were hard to understand. Many paths through the snow show that many people used them regularly. However, these paths connected places that were separated by terrain features that should have made travel very hard or even impossible. Even more puzzling, the footprints had traits that didn't match any known types of shoes or foot coverings that people in the area used. Some tracks looked like they were made by people who were barefoot, even though it was freezing outside. Others looked like they were made by shoes or boots that were bigger and shaped differently than any boots or shoes that people in the area were used to. What worried me the most were impressions that showed people moving across snow-covered ground without sinking as deeply as would be expected because the snow was soft and powdery. When Reverend Isaiah Morris finally got to Black Hollow on the 18th of January, 1893, he found a community that was having a hard time making sense of things that seemed to go against what they thought they knew about how people act and how nature works. Reverend Morris was a well-educated and experienced man who had worked in frontier communities in Missouri and Arkansas for more than 15 years. He had handled cases of mental illness, domestic violence, and different kinds of religious extremism, and strange situations or behavior didn't bother him very much. The first time he met with the Kelly family and community leaders gave him a full picture of the situation, but he said he wanted to do his own investigation before making any decisions about what to do next. His first priority was to talk to Hinrich in person, both to check on the boy's mental and physical health and to get first-hand accounts of what he had seen. Hinrich's testimony to Reverend Morris was very detailed, consistent, and very disturbing. The boy said that his family had been going through a planned change that had started shortly after Samuel went missing and had sped up over the winter. He said that this change included not only changes in behavior and appearance, but also the gaining of knowledge and skills that seemed to go beyond what normal people can do. The Reverend was especially upset by Hinrich's descriptions of what his mother did and where she got the information and materials she used for her work. The boy said that Martha had gotten her hands on written records and documents that had a lot of information about Black Hollow's history and geography. These were things that seemed to have been made by people who used to live there, but whose names and fates were still unknown. Hinrich says that these papers had maps of cave systems that went far beyond what the people who lived there now had explored. They also had detailed descriptions of chambers and passages that had artifacts and markings left by people who lived there before. More importantly, the materials seemed to give Martha instructions on how to do different experiments and procedures with local plants and minerals. Hinrich also talked about how his mother seemed to be able to talk to people who weren't there and have long conversations that seemed to involve sharing complicated information about a wide range of topics, from local history to advanced medical and chemical techniques. These communications seemed to happen both when Martha was alone in the cave systems and when the boy saw mysterious visitors meeting with her at night from his hidden spot in the cabin's loft. The second thing Reverend Morris wanted to do was try to talk directly to the Grimm family members, especially Martha and Jacob. This turned out to be harder than he thought it would be, because neither person seemed willing or able to engage in normal social interaction. Martha recognized him as a religious leader and his presence, but the way she answered his questions and tried to help him made it clear that she saw their conversation in a way that was very different from how most people see relationships and problems. The Reverend was most concerned about the fact that Martha seemed to know things and events that she couldn't have found out about in any other way. She accurately described recent events in communities across the region, such as births, deaths, marriages, and other important events in places she had never been to and with people she had never met. It was even more troubling that she talked about historical events and geographical features that weren't recorded in any documents or maps that were available. Martha spoke with authority about the activities of Native American groups who had lived in the area long before Europeans came, giving details about their customs, beliefs, and fate that made it seem like she had access to first-hand accounts or written records that had never been made public. She also showed that she knew a lot about the huge cave systems that honeycombed the limestone bedrock under Black Hollow. She described chambers and passages that weren't shown on any maps and gave accurate directions to places that would have taken years of careful exploration to find. When Reverend Morris asked Martha how she knew this, she talked about ways of getting information that were outside of what people normally do to learn and talk to each other. Jacob Grimm's interview with the Reverend was also disturbing, but for different reasons. The man who had once been a good farmer and a respected member of the community was now in a state of constant fear and confusion. He talked about his wife as if she were a stranger who had taken the place of the woman he had married. He talked about changes in her personality, knowledge, and abilities that couldn't be explained by normal human growth or adaptation. Jacob said that Martha now had access to information and skills that no one else could have gotten through normal study or experience. This was the most important thing, he said. He said that he saw her do procedures and experiments that needed knowledge of chemistry, botany, and medicine that she had never formally studied. However, her work showed that she understood things that would have been impressive even for someone with a lot of academic training. Jacob also said that Martha seemed to talk to people who weren't there on a regular basis and have long conversations about complicated technical topics that he didn't understand. These conversations took place both when she was working alone and during the strange nighttime meetings that Henrik had talked about. This suggests that she had a network of contacts that used methods that were hard to explain. Jacob's claims about changes in the physical environment around their home were probably the most worrisome of all. He talked about finding changes to cave entrances and underground passages that seemed to have been made recently, but the work would have needed tools and methods that the people who lived nearby didn't have. It looks like these changes were made to make it easier to get to parts of the cave systems that had never been explored before. They made a network of connected chambers that went deep below the surface of Black Hollow. Reverend Morris stayed in the hollow for a few more days, trying to learn more about what was going on and talking to community leaders about what to do next. But the harsh winter weather and the Grimm family's apparent unwillingness to accept help or intervention from others made his investigation more difficult. On the 25th of January 1893, he made his last attempt to talk to the Grimm family directly. He traveled through deep snow with Thomas Kelly and 2 other community leaders to visit the Grimm homestead. What they found there was worse than they could have imagined, and it would be the start of rumors and speculation that would last for generations in the area. The outside of the cabin looked like it had been used recently, which didn't fit with the family's situation of being alone. New paths through the snow linked the main building to other buildings and cave entrances. However, these paths showed signs of use by more than one person, but we don't know who they were. The tracks that went to and from the homestead were even more confusing. They looked like people who didn't live in the area came by regularly. Since the Kellys' last visit, the inside of the cabin had changed even more. There were new tools and materials that looked like they were for Martha's ongoing experiments and activities. The main living area now looked like a mix of a lab and a workshop, with glass containers, measuring devices, and preserved specimens arranged in ways that the visitors couldn't understand. Martha's health had gotten worse, and her body showed signs of malnutrition or illness, even though the house seemed to have plenty of preserved food and other supplies. During the visit, she was polite but distant, as if she were meeting strangers instead of neighbors and religious leaders who had known her for years. What worried me the most were the things she said about work and duties that she said were very important, not just to her family, but to the whole community and region. During this visit, the visitors couldn't find Jacob, but Martha assured them that he was safe and well cared for. When asked for more details about where he was, she said he was doing things that needed privacy and focus work that was important to the success of the projects she was working on. Her calm confidence about his condition was very different from the fear and confusion that the visitors had seen in him during their last visit. During the visit, young Rebecca only showed up for a short time, but her condition scared the community leaders even more than her mother's change had. The girl looked like she had lost a lot of weight, and her eyes showed signs of being very tired, which could mean she hadn't slept in a long time or was under a lot of stress. The most concerning thing was that she didn't seem able or willing to talk directly to the visitors. Instead, she only answered questions with gestures or one-word answers that didn't give them much useful information. Everyone who came to see Mary was very worried about her because they couldn't explain why she wasn't there. Martha's claims that the child was safe and well cared for were not true because the other family members were clearly upset, and there was more and more disturbing evidence of activities that no responsible parent would let a young child do. On the 27th of January 1893, Reverend Morris left Black Hollow with serious worries about the safety of the Grimm family and the community as a whole. In his official report to church leaders, he suggested that law enforcement and medical professionals get involved right away But he admitted that the remote location and bad weather made it very hard to set up or carry out such intervention. What was more worrying was his private view of the situation, which he wrote about in personal journals that were not found until many years after he died. In these private writings, Reverend Morris said he wasn't sure he could understand or deal with the things that seemed to be going on in Black Hollow. He said that he saw signs of knowledge and skills that were beyond what he had seen in normal human behavior. He also said that the situation might need more than just religious or legal help to fix it. The Grimm family's situation didn't get any better in February 1893. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse faster as winter came to an end. The bad weather that had kept Black Hollow cut off from the rest of the world all winter started to ease up. There were times when the temperature dropped and the snow stopped falling, which made it possible to travel and talk to people outside of Black Hollow. During one of these short breaks in the weather, the most shocking and disturbing things of the whole crisis finally happened. Rebecca Grimm showed up at the Kelly homestead on the 22nd of February 1893 in the early morning hours. She was wearing a torn and bloody nightgown and had bare feet, even though the ground was frozen. She was completely hysterical and could barely speak clearly, but she was trying hard to get across that something horrible had happened at her family's cabin. Rebecca's broken story of what happened that night would later be the most detailed first-hand account of the Grimm family's ordeal in its final stages. She said that noises of fighting and struggle coming from the main living area of the cabin woke her up before dawn. When she looked into it, she saw her mother in a fight with several people whose identities were still unclear in the dark. The girl said that these people were not from the area, but they looked like the strange visitors who had been coming to the cabin all winter. But their behavior during this last meeting was very different from the peaceful meetings that Henrik had talked about in his earlier testimony. This time, there were loud fights, physical fights, and what Rebecca called attempts by the visitors to take things and materials from the cabin against Martha's wishes. This was different from the quiet, orderly exchange of information and materials that had happened on previous visits. Rebecca was most scared by how her mother reacted to this fight. Martha seemed to have gotten stronger and more capable than what is normal for a human being. She defended her things and her territory with a ferocity that seemed impossible for someone in her weakened state. The girl said she saw her mother beat up several adults using weapons and techniques that she couldn't have learned through normal training or experience. The mysterious visitors seemed to have left after the fight, but not before taking a lot of the materials and tools that Martha had been using for her experiments and research. Rebecca's story about how her mother acted after this meeting was even more disturbing. Martha had apparently gone through some kind of breakdown or change that made it impossible for her to recognize her daughter or respond to attempts to talk to her. Martha was so scared and confused that she thought Rebecca was one of the people who had been trying to steal her things. She attacked the girl with the same level of violence she had shown when she confronted the real intruders. Rebecca was only able to get away by running through deep snow and dangerous terrain into the winter night to get to the safety of the Kelly homestead. William Kelly quickly put together a group of men to look into the Grimm cabin and try to save any family members who might still be in danger. Thomas Kelly, Reverend Morris, who was still in the area, and 3 other community leaders who had dealt with emergencies and crisis intervention were all at the party. They made the hard trip through the snow and got to the homestead just as the sun was starting to rise on what would turn out to be one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. The outside of the cabin clearly showed signs of the violent fight that Rebecca had talked about. There were bloodstains and other signs of a fight in the snow around the building, which had been trampled and disturbed. The tracks leading away from the cabin were even more confusing. They looked like they belonged to more than one person, but they didn't match the footprints of anyone who lived nearby. The inside of the cabin was completely destroyed, which made it look like someone had searched it systematically and then gotten really angry. The furniture had been turned over and broken. The dishes and other household items had been broken and left all over the rooms. And the materials that Martha had been using for her experiments had either been taken away or destroyed. The most disturbing thing was the strange symbols carved into the wooden walls. They looked like they had been made during the violent struggle and followed patterns that were similar to those found in the cave systems in the area. Jacob Grimm was found in the root cellar, but his condition made it clear that he had not lived through what had happened the night before. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the doctor who was called from Forsyth to look at the scene, didn't give any specific information in his official report because of the type of injuries he had. He only said that the death looked like it was caused by extreme violence and that the injuries didn't fit with any kind of accident or self-inflicted wound. It was even worse that both Martha and young Mary were completely missing. Even after a thorough search of the cabin and the area around it, no sign of either person could be found. We followed the tracks away from the homestead as far as we could, but they stopped at the rocky outcropping where Samuel's trail had ended months earlier. This suggests that there was a link between the current disappearances and the original mystery that started the family's troubles. Sheriff Henry Colson led the official investigation that followed, with help from deputies from the state capitol and a group of investigators who were experts in violent crimes and missing persons cases. But the remote location, the bad weather, and the strange nature of the evidence made their job very hard and, in the end, they couldn't come to any conclusions. The investigators were able to confirm that Jacob Grimm had been killed and that Martha and Mary Grimm were missing. The circumstances suggested that they either left on their own or were taken. But the physical evidence at the scene raised more questions than it answered, and the testimony of the surviving witnesses was so strange that it made it hard for the investigators to come up with clear ideas about what really happened. The fact that the activities in the cabin before the final violent confrontation seemed so advanced was the most confusing. The lab equipment and research materials that had been partially destroyed or taken away suggested that there had been systematic scientific work going on that Martha Grimm could not have had the education or resources to do. The carved symbols all over the cabin matched markings found in different cave systems in the area. This suggests that there were links to a larger network of people and activities whose identities were still unknown. Chemical tests on the debris left behind by the destroyed lab equipment showed that there were compounds and substances that were not native to Missouri and that could not have been easily obtained through normal business channels. Some of the materials looked like they came from plants that only grew in far-off places, while others looked like they were made in a lab using very advanced methods for the time. The discovery of human remains in different stages of preservation was probably the most disturbing thing of all. The materials looked like they had been used in Martha's experiments, but it was impossible to figure out where they came from using the methods that were available. The way these remains were handled and cared for showed an understanding of anatomy and chemistry that would have been amazing even for trained doctors of the time. The investigation officially ended in April 1893. Jacob Grimm's death was ruled a murder by people who were never found, and Martha and Mary Grimm were listed as missing persons. There were warrants out for Martha's arrest in connection with her husband's death, but it was impossible to find her because there was no clear evidence of where she was or what had happened to her. Rebecca Grimm was sent to live with distant relatives in Springfield, Missouri, where she stayed for the rest of her short life. People who knew her in her last years said that she was a young woman who had been changed forever by what happened to her in Black Hollow. She didn't talk about her family or the things she had seen very often, and when she did, her stories were often incomplete and contradictory. Doctors who looked at Rebecca saw signs of severe psychological trauma that seemed to be worse than what would normally be expected from someone who had lost a family member in a violent way. She exhibited symptoms indicative of exposure to experiences that fundamentally disrupted her perception of reality, and she never completely regained the capacity to establish typical social connections or operate autonomously within conventional society. It was officially said that Rebecca died of consumption in 1901 when she was 25 years old. However, the doctors who treated her during her last illness noticed strange things about her condition that they couldn't explain with normal medical knowledge. It seems that she had been writing to people she didn't know while she lived in Springfield, getting letters and packages that she never told her caretakers or family about. More interestingly, Rebecca seemed to have kept showing some of the strange skills that other members of her family had. She had an amazing amount of knowledge about things happening far away, and she knew more about natural events and scientific principles than what could have been learned in school or through experience. After Rebecca died, her family members looked through her things in the hopes of learning more about her life, and maybe even finding other family members who were still alive. Her things included journals, letters, and other items that gave the most detailed account of the Grimm family's activities and the forces that ultimately led to their destruction. These papers showed that the family's connection to the strange knowledge and skills that brought them down had started much earlier than anyone had thought. Rebecca's private writings say that the Grimms were part of a network of people and families in the Ozark region who were trying to keep old ways of knowing that they thought had been passed down from people who lived in the area before them. It seems that this network worked by sending messages in writing and meeting in person, but they were very careful not to let the rest of the community know about them. Members talked about what they had found in caves, artifacts and markings that gave them clues about what people did in the past, and ways to access states of consciousness and perception that went beyond what normal people could do. Rebecca said that Samuel's disappearance was not an accident, but a planned move to a different level of involvement with this hidden knowledge. He had been chosen because he had shown that he was sensitive to the forces and influences that the network was studying. His apparent disappearance was actually a kind of graduation to activities that required him to completely separate from normal society. Martha had changed a lot over the winter of 1892-93 because she was trying to follow Samuel's path and get as close to the hidden knowledge that the network kept as he did. But some groups in the network were against her efforts because they thought she was going too fast and taking risks that could put the safety of their other activities at risk. The violent fight that led to Jacob's death and the destruction of the cabin was the end of a fight between these two groups. Martha chose to join Samuel instead of giving in to the restrictions that her opponents wanted to put on her work. Mary's absence made it seem like she had been taken on this trip, either as a participant or as a hostage whose fate was tied to her family's fate. Rebecca's journals also gave a lot of information about the locations and contents of different cave systems in the Black Hollow area. This information had been collected over many generations by network members who had carefully explored and documented the underground chambers and passages. These caves seem to have had large collections of artifacts, written records, and preserved materials that showed what people did who lived in a civilization that was smarter and more capable than modern American society. Most importantly, Rebecca's writing suggested that the network's work was still going on even though her family had died in a terrible way. Other people and groups were still exploring, documenting, and putting the hidden knowledge to use. She gave names, places, and coded ways of communicating that showed an organization that was very large and advanced, one that had been able to operate for decades without being found by authorities or outsiders. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a professor of anthropology at Washington University who had been studying the folklore and legends of the Ozark region, started a new investigation after finding Rebecca's papers. Dr. Hartwell knew that the materials gave him new information about ways of knowing and organizing society that had been thought to be based on superstition or fantasy. Between 1901 and 1905, he looked into the cave systems that Rebecca had written about in her journals in a systematic way. He also tried to find and talk to other people in the network she had described. This work was very dangerous because it took place in remote areas and network members seemed to be hostile to outside interference. However, Dr. Hartwell's findings changed how people think about the cultural and historical importance of the Ozark region. Dr. Hartwell's team looked into cave systems that showed signs of people living and working there for hundreds of years. These included major changes to natural chambers and passages that showed advanced engineering and construction skills. The underground places where they kept collections of written materials, scientific tools, and preserved specimens were even more impressive. They showed a level of organized research and documentation that was on par with what major academic institutions do. Chemical analysis of materials discovered in the caves indicated the presence of compounds and substances not indigenous to North America, which could not be readily elucidated by established trade relations or communication networks. Some of the materials looked like they had been made using methods that were very advanced for the time periods in which they were supposedly made. This suggests that the people who made them had access to scientific knowledge that was beyond what was generally available in American society in the 19th century. The most interesting thing was the large number of written records found in different caves. These records gave detailed accounts of what network members had done and found over many generations. These records talked about how to study natural phenomena in a systematic way, how to improve human consciousness and perception, and how to use knowledge in ways that don't seem to come from traditional European or American intellectual traditions. The written materials also showed that network groups in different parts of the country were able to talk to and work with each other. This showed that the organization was much bigger than just the Missouri Ozarks, and that it had been able to stay organized even though its communities were isolated and independent. There were references to similar groups working in remote parts of Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and other states. This suggests that there is a network that is very large and long-lasting. Dr. Hartwell's team also found proof that the network had kept detailed records of interactions with people whose cultural and technological development was more advanced than that of most Americans. It seemed that these contacts gave the network access to knowledge and skills that were the basis for many of its activities. However, the documentation that was available did not make it clear who these advanced people were or where they lived. Most importantly, the cave exploration showed that the network was still active, which means that it had survived the problems and crises that had affected families and communities, like the Grimms. New changes to cave systems, new materials and supplies, and upkeep of equipment and facilities showed that the work was still going on, even though there had been losses and setbacks. Dr. Hartwell tried to get in touch with people who were still on the network, but these attempts failed. They may have led to stricter security measures that made it harder to investigate further. His last report, which he finished in 1905, talked about how big and complicated the group he had found was, but it also said that there were still many questions about what it was doing now and what its goals were. The university authorities first kept the report secret because they were worried about how the public would react and possible safety problems with the remote cave systems. But copies were sent to federal agencies and colleges and universities that did research in anthropology and archaeology. This led to more investigations that happened sporadically in the early 1900s. These follow-up investigations confirmed and built on Dr. Hartwell's work, showing that the network had indeed survived and was still working even though outside authorities were paying more attention to it. There was proof that they were systematically expanding into new areas, coming up with more advanced ways to communicate and work together, and continuing to improve how they use the knowledge and skills that are the basis of their work. Investigators were more concerned by signs that network members had started to reach levels of skill and integration with their hidden knowledge that were higher than what previous generations had done. There were reports of people who had skills that seemed to go beyond what most people can do, such as better sensory perception, the ability to withstand extreme weather, and ways of communicating that didn't rely on standard technology. By the 1,920 seconds, the federal government was worried enough about what the network was doing that it started to keep an eye on it and look into it. But these official programs didn't work very well because the network had very strong security and it was very hard to work in the remote areas where they were most active. The few investigators who were able to get past network security and see what they were doing firsthand came back with stories that were so strange that people often thought they were making them up or exaggerating. These reports talked about underground facilities that had technology that was much more advanced than what was available at the time, people who seemed to have had physical and mental changes that made them stronger than normal humans, and proof that they were talking to groups or entities whose nature and location were completely unknown. In the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, the network's activities seemed to slow down or become even harder to find. This could have been because the government was paying more attention to them and because of the problems caused by the Great Depression and World War II. But there were still occasional reports of strange things happening and strange events happening in the Ozarks and other places where network activity had been recorded before. After the war, investigators got better at their jobs, which made the government more interested in the network and what it was doing. But when people tried to find and study the cave systems and facilities that had been recorded in earlier investigations, they often found that these places had been abandoned, hidden, or destroyed on purpose to keep people from getting to them. Dr. Patricia Wells of the University of Missouri conducted the most thorough examination of the network's history and current condition in 1965, a full 60 years after Dr. Hartwell's work. Her research was helped by being able to look at government documents that had been kept secret and new archaeological methods that gave her new information about the organization's activities and their importance. Dr. Wells's investigation showed that the network had survived the many problems and changes of the 20th century, but it looked like it was doing things very differently now than it did in the past. Evidence suggested that the organization had adapted to changing conditions by becoming more decentralized and technologically advanced, using methods that made it harder for outside authorities to find out what was going on and look into it. Dr. Wells found more important evidence that the network's long-term goals included getting ready for changes in society and the environment that they thought were necessary and unavoidable. There were plans and preparations that seemed to be meant to keep and protect certain kinds of knowledge and skills during times of social and technological upheaval that the network thought would happen in the future. The findings were so important that federal officials quickly classified Dr. Wells's final report and have never made it available for public review. But parts of her research were used in government planning documents about national security and emergency preparedness, which shows that official agencies took the network's goals and abilities seriously. Today, almost 130 years after the terrible events that killed the Grimm family, the Black Hollow area is still mostly the same as it was in the 1,890 seconds. The area has been set aside as protected wilderness, which means that casual exploration and development are not allowed. This will help keep any secrets the area may still have. There are still reports of strange things happening in the area from time to time, like lights and sounds that can't be explained and signs of human activity in places that are supposed to be empty. People usually write off these reports as natural events or the imaginations of hikers and hunters. But the fact that they keep coming up suggests that some kind of activity may still be going on in the region's remote cave systems and hidden facilities. There are many government and academic archives that keep the official records of the Grimm family tragedy and the investigations that followed. However, access to a lot of this information is still limited. The story has mostly been forgotten by the public, but local historians and researchers who study the folklore and legends of the Ozark region still remember it. But for those who have looked at the evidence and thought about what it means, the Black Hollow case is much more than just a tragic event on the frontier. The systematic nature of the activities documented over more than a century, the sophistication of the knowledge and techniques involved, and the apparent continuation of the work despite various disruptions and challenges suggest an organization of remarkable persistence and capability. The existence of groups operating in the remote American wilderness, with objectives that surpass the goals and comprehension of mainstream society, prompts essential inquiries regarding the essence of human potential and the types of knowledge that may exist beyond traditional academic and scientific institutions. It is still not clear from the evidence whether the network's actions are a good way to keep ancient knowledge alive, a dangerous quest for power that could upset social order, or something else entirely. The story of Martha Grimm and her family's tragic fate is a clear example of how people can achieve things and organize themselves in ways that are not well known or understood by the general public. The mountains and forests of Missouri still keep their secrets, but the evidence that has been found so far suggests that these secrets hold powers and knowledge that could be very important for the future of humanity. The Black Hollow case is a good example of how there are still things about human experience and potential that we don't fully understand, even in this day and age of global communication and scientific progress. Maybe one day, when people are smart enough and brave enough to safely explore these hidden forms of knowledge, the sealed caves and secret facilities of the Ozark Mountains will be opened, and their contents will be fully examined. Until then, they stay the same, as Martha Grimm left them over 100 years ago. Places where people did things that were beyond the understanding of their time and are still waiting for future generations to have the courage and vision to figure them out. The hollow is quiet now, and its secrets are hidden under layers of stone and government classification. But the wind that blows through the old trees still carries echoes of the knowledge and skills that people who lived there once sought, people whose vision went far beyond the limits of their time.